Thank you for joining the Generic Drug Forum today as we untangle the life cycle of a generic drug. I'm Sarah Ibrahim, the Associate Director of Global Generic Drug Affairs, and today I will provide you with an overview of OGD's global program. By the end of this presentation, you will have learned more about our Global Affairs program, our generic drug global engagement and harmonization efforts, and provide you with an update on new developments in ICH since the publication of the ICH reflection paper. The American public expects high-quality, safe, and effective medicines. This is an equal expectation from a brand and a generic. A generic drug product is one that is therapeutically equivalent to the innovator product, or commonly referred to as the reference listed drug, or RLD. In order for a generic drug to be approved, this requires that the applicant submits a test product that is pharmaceutically equivalent and bioequivalent to the RLD. Drug companies submit an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA, to the FDA for approval to market a generic drug. The ANDA process doesn't require the applicant to repeat extensive and costly animal and clinical studies. This allows for rapid introduction to generic medications to be brought to the market at a substantially lower cost, thereby increasing access to medications by the public. A key objective of the generic drug program and the agency as a whole is ensuring the quality, safety, and efficacy of generic medications, and by ensuring the approval is based on robust science, generics are in fact held to the same standards as brand drugs, thereby promoting and protecting public health. 2021 marks the 37th anniversary of the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984, also known as the HatchWaxman Amendments. These amendments established the modern-day approval pathway for generic drugs. Now, when the Hatch-Waxman Amendments were enacted, generic drugs accounted for only 19% of all prescription drugs dispensed in the United States. Due to FDA's actions and policies advanced under the Hatch-Waxman Amendments, along with the Generic Drug User Fee Amendments, or GDUFA, today almost 90% of prescriptions filled in the United States are generic drugs. Through competition, generics improve patient access with significant reduction in drug pricing. Currently, brand name drugs represent only 10% of prescriptions in the United States, but stand at around 80% of drug spending, while the other 90% of prescriptions in the United States are dispensed using generic drugs. Generic drugs save healthcare spending by an average of $3 billion. In fact, when both brand and generic versions are prescribed and are both available, the generic is chosen about 97% of the time. This is particularly attributed to reduction in out-of-pocket spending. Generic drugs are characterized by rapid entrance to a new market and are predominantly associated with significant reduction in drug pricing. The significant reduction of out-of-pocket costs for patients represent an accomplishment, saving the U.S. healthcare system more than $2.2 trillion in the past decade alone. Over the past 30 years, pharmaceutical manufacturing has become more global in nature, and as early as the 1970s, industry moved away from mainland United States in response to tax incentives, first to Puerto Rico, and then to Europe, and then nations that were developing at the time, such as China and India. Developing nations can provide substantial cost savings to pharmaceutical companies due to lower labor, energy, and transportation costs. It's also noteworthy that there is often less rigorous environmental regulations. A World Bank study estimated that in 2004, China and India held a cost advantage of about 40% when compared to the United States and Europe. And in a similar FDA 2011 report titled Pathway to Global Product Safety and Quality, also noted that both China and India enjoy a labor cost advantage and that manufacturing active pharmaceutical ingredients in such nations can reduce costs for U.S. and European companies by an estimated 30 to 40%. Now, the highly globalized pharmaceutical industry convoluted changes in culture, policies, research, manufacturing, and regulations. Manufacturing of pharmaceuticals has become a global endeavor, crossing numerous borders around the world. Not only have supply chains grown in complexity, but medications have also become more complex. Now, the graph here demonstrates the magnitude of global distribution of ANDA applications submitted to the FDA. And when reviewing the significance of the shared geographical distribution that represents ANDA submissions, please consider the complexity of the nature of applications, where applicant location indicated in the submission may not be representative of the API or totality of facility locations across the globe. In understanding the current regulatory environment, it's important to recognize the growing complexity of medications, research, development, production, and manufacturing. Navigating through the complex global landscape and ensuring that U.S. imports have been manufactured according to FDA rigorous regulatory requirements is a significant challenge, given that 150 plus countries do export to the United States, each have their own laws and standards. Now, regulatory agencies regulate medical products in an extremely globalized environment while they function under domestic regulations, requiring fortified national sovereignty, and for this reason, regulatory agencies are involved in a number of bilateral and multilateral engagements to achieve a higher level of international cooperation. Now, as we mentioned, pharmaceutical products are developed globally, but as discussed, are regulated through domestic regulations. The FDA in particular has been applauded for its integral role in protecting the American public from unsafe and ineffective products and is committed to advancing the international harmonization of scientific and technical standards for generic drug development. Generic drug developers theoretically would be able to implement a single application or a single drug development program globally, or at least employing common application elements. Common standards for global development for generics can improve access to generic medications, and ICH is uniquely positioned to develop harmonized recommendations, thereby expanding the anticipated convergence. Global harmonization for generic drugs is not new and dates back to 2001 WHO report. FDA strategically leveraged ICH reform initiated at the end of 2015 to propose generic drug initiatives, and established a unique global affairs program at Office of Generic Drugs at the end of 2015. The ICH Generic Drug Group, or GDG, was established in 2019 following endorsement of the ICH reflection paper, Further Opportunities for Harmonization of Standards for Generics. The ICH GDG serves as a technical discussion group for issues relevant to harmonization of scientific and technical standards for generic drugs, and recommends areas for harmonization such as ICH, under ICH, and assesses the feasibility and impact of harmonizing efforts, and to further ICH in identifying recommended topic areas for harmonization. They are also tasked with surveying existing ICH and World Health Organization guidelines to assess gaps in guidances for generic drugs and to prioritize the work and areas to nominate recommendations to ICH. Some key proposals in the ICH reflection paper outlines a strategic approach for developing and enhancing ICH guidelines to support the harmonization of scientific and technical standards for generic drugs. These guidelines will include tools for demonstrating equivalence for non-complex dosage forms and more complex dosage forms and products. It proposes steps and recommendations for global harmonization of standards for generic drugs. The reflection paper recognizes that different regions have different regulatory frameworks. For example, the US FDA does not allow a generic drug and its reference product to be of a different oral dosage form. In contrast, the European Union, through EMA, allows a generic drug and its reference product to be different oral dosage forms if the product meets bioequivalence criteria. The reflection paper focuses on harmonizing scientific standards for bioequivalence that can be used within the existing regulatory framework. It further outlines issues related to more complex products currently on the horizon, such as modified release products, complex injectables, transdermals, topical dermatological, and inhalation products. The work of GDG paved the path for the development of the ICH M13 Expert Working Group, which was formed in July of 2020. And represents the first topic since the ICH reorganization in 2016 that is specifically focused on generic medications. M13, titled Bioequivalence for Immediate Release Solid Oral Dosage Forms, is the foundation for establishing the safety and efficacy of immediate release solid dosage generics. And scientific harmonization of these study designs would, and I quote, allow the rationalization of some important aspects of the conduct of these trials and optimize product development, and was hailed by global industry with the vision that bioequivalence studies worldwide would be conducted under common expectations, thereby increasing efficiency of generic drug development, increasing quality of the generic drug development, and a crucial first step toward global development of generic products. Now, in addition to engagement with ICH, OGD continues leading efforts in numerous working groups within the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program and global bioequivalence harmonization initiatives. Although progress has been made in defining common ground, it's important to continue these discussions, especially with the anticipated increase in number of complex products that are currently under development. The rise of technology has accelerated complex drug product development, and shortly after, we anticipate the generic version. This evolution is expected to continue. The complex drug landscape categorizes such product based on challenges associated with the assessment and establishment of pharmaceutical equivalence and bioequivalence. Now, FDA is well-resourced and skilled, yet sees the benefit of cooperation and collaboration with other regulatory authorities to avoid effort duplication and improve decision-making. And encouraging generic competition for complex products offers increased patient access at a lower cost. Now, from a marketing and savings perspective, a concise estimate is not as predictable as simpler generics. But as the FDA noted in the 2019 Office of Generic Drugs annual report, the out-of-pocket cost for generic Advair was reportedly less than half of the out-of-pocket cost for brand drug. FDA launched a drug competition action plan that focused on key principles designed to facilitate generic drug competition, promote patient access, and improve the economics of developing generic medications. And FDA looks beyond its borders with regards to enforcement. 37 years ago, when HatchWaxman amendments was enacted, generic drugs accounted for only 19% of all prescription drugs purchased in the United States. Complex generic drug products did not exist, and the pharmaceutical industry was not as globalized. Our opportunity for harmonization is now, and movement toward common standards for global development for generics can improve access to generic products with substantial healthcare savings. We recognize that products with small markets may not be economically viable unless we can aggregate those molecules through such convergence efforts. And the massive investment in development of complex generics can only be supported and cost substantially mitigated by entering into multiple markets. We recognize the challenge from the differences in nomenclature, terminology, and subsequently labeling to report practices. The lack of international endorsed political, economic, and social support can be a hindrance. And even if a legal foundation is established, other impediments do occur, such as economic resistance, insufficient knowledge, capabilities, and resources for national regulatory authorities. So what role can industry play? Well, industry can invest in research and development, participate in ICH expert working groups, share relevant data on regulatory and scientific challenges, provide useful input into ICH discussions and other platforms for regulatory negotiations, and assisting in addressing challenges for harmonization of standards. Generic drugs comprise a significant portion of the pharmaceutical market, and common standards for global development for generics can improve access to generic medicines. OGD recognizes that ICH is uniquely positioned to develop harmonized recommendations as the global venue for harmonization of standards for pharmaceutical products. ICH reflection paper on further opportunities for harmonization of standards for generic drugs lays out the strategy for global harmonization for generic drugs, and OGD will continue discussions of harmonization to lead in global standards for generic drug equivalence. So just a poll question. Before today, I knew OGD had a generic drug global program or had absolutely no idea OGD's generic drug global program exists. Now, our first challenge question, which of the following statements is not true? ICH is focused only on new drugs. ICH impacts both new and generic drugs. ICH aims to provide uniform standards for pharmaceuticals for human use. ICH guidelines are developed by regulatory and pharma authorities. And the incorrect statement is ICH is focused only on new drugs. Our second challenge question, ICH M13 is focused on the bioequivalence for immediate release solid oral dosage forms, will result in product developers not having to generate multiple sets of data and information to support marketing authorizations in more than one jurisdiction. It is the first guideline to be fully dedicated to generic drug development, and all the statements are correct. And the correct answer is all the above. Now I will leave you with a closing thought for today. As regulators, we recognize that there is a communal and social appeal for faster generic drug approvals. And with the unprecedented globalization of pharmaceutical industry, globalization of generic drug development encourages a more harmonized generic drug development process that can only be achieved by the convergence of the technical requirements among the different regulatory agencies. And with that,